detailing the Top Gun aircraft carrier.
Hi, I'm Connie Christians, videographer and video editor for ToyMakingPlans.com. Today's video accompanies the assembly instructions for the Top Gun aircraft carrier. In this video, our craftsman Udi shares some helpful tips on the detail finishing, beginning with the compound angle cut for the hull, some special tower modifications, masking and painting tips for the hull and flight deck components, as well as the final assembly. We hope you find this video helpful during the construction process. I want to thank our craftsman Imaz Udris, or Udi, for providing the excellent content for this video.
How to complete the hull assembly and cutting the hull angle another way. Here is an alternate and safe methodology in cutting the hull angle cut for the Top Gun aircraft carrier. This procedure only requires two shop tools, the chop saw and the table saw. Cutting a larger and wider piece of wood, or an assembly, on the table saw is a lot safer than cutting smaller, thinner pieces of wood. The blade height is quite high and can be a bit intimidating. The blade is also angled, exposing more blade surface than when cutting 90-degree cuts. Cutting angles and compound angles is a bit unsafe when using push sticks and featherboards. Our craftsman Udi always looks for a safer way to accomplish the cut. Start with a glued up hull assembly. Let's begin with the previously assembled hull assembly. As you can see, 1L and 1R have been glued together with 2L and 2R. You will notice two additional parts have been added to the stern. The purpose of these additional components will be discussed later. Here you can see the bow of the hull assembly and the layout cut lines. To be able to cut the hull as an assembly on the table saw, the assembly must be made to look like a box. To make this box, a spacer is required to keep 1L and 1R parallel in width through its entire length. It was necessary to cut a block of wood equal in width to the combined width of 2L and 2R. It was then positioned between 1L and 1R and using a clamp temporarily holding it in position. This block is not glued in place. It is only a setup spacer. Remember, the PT boat enters into the stern of the hull on the completed assembly. The second part that was added is the rear stiffener plate. This part is screwed into 1L and 1R. It ensures that 1L and 1R continue to be parallel to each other and at the same time equal in width to the inside bow dimensions. The clamp can now be removed. Screwing this into 1L and 1R is not a problem. Upon completion of the hull angle cuts, it will be removed and the holes filled in prior to finishing. Here we see the bow has been cut using the chop saw to the required 45-degree angles. Pretty simple and safe. A 10-inch chop saw was used here. Most 10-inch chop saws will comfortably cut a 3.5-inch piece of wood. It's the same thickness as a 2x4 piece of framing lumber. Setting up the table saw for a 30-degree cut. Using one of Udi's homemade angle templates, the saw blade was tilted to 30 degrees. The angle template was placed on the offcut side of the blade. This angle, defined in the ToyMakingPlans.com, is not critical. It is only for visual effect. Its actual angle can be modified to your equipment and capabilities. The angle template was used to check the keeper side of the saw blade. And you can take it one step further and check the saw blade with a digital angle finder. This looks good to me. Let's continue. Set up for cutting part 1L to 30 degrees. With the saw blade tilted at its desired angle, it is time to cut the hull. The table saw rip fence is now moved into position to angle cut part 1L. For you nautically minded woodworkers, we will cut the port side of the hull. The hull assembly will be fed into the saw blade front to back, or bow to stern. Don't be too concerned with the positioning of the saw blade. Start to the right of the intended cut line and work your way into where you want the finished cut to be. Do as many multiple passes as necessary, moving the rip fence closer to the saw blade as needed. This was done comfortably and safely with the hands in position on the front and the back of the assembly, while feeding the assembly through the saw blade. A downward pressure and a sideways pressure can be safely applied against the rip fence at the same time, ensuring that the whole assembly will be flat on the table saw surface and parallel to the rip fence. Here you can see the setup from the top looking down with the rip fence on the left. This view is looking from the back of the table saw, showing the intended location of the cut. Here's another view looking from the back of the table saw. You can see the cut in progress. This was not the first cut. Multiple passes were made until the marked cut lines were reached. This view shows the hull assembly exiting the saw blade. And that's it. The 30-degree angle cut on Part 1L is complete. Do not adjust the rip fence. The positioning of the rip fence is exactly where it should be to cut the 30-degree angle cut on Part 1R. The hull assembly will now be reversed. We will then cut the hull assembly, feeding it into the saw blade from back to front or from stern to bow. Set up for cutting Part 1R to 30 degrees. Here's a view of the hull assembly from the rear of the table saw. The 1L side is against the rip fence and Part 1R is being cut. You can see that the rear of the assembly, or the stern, is being fed into the saw blade first. Again, for the nautically minded, we are cutting the starboard side of the hull, stern to bow. This view is showing the front or bow of the hull assembly exiting the saw blade. Set up for the 30-degree bow cut across 1L, 1R, 2L, and 2R. Cutting the bow angles is a bit more complex, but easily and safely accomplished with a little setup. The first thing to do is to remove the rip fence. It is not required for this setup. The next tool that is required is the table saw miter gauge. Adjust the miter gauge to 45 degrees right of the 0-degree position and lock it into place. Position the miter gauge into the right side travel guide slot of the table saw surface. Remove and reposition the auxiliary fence which was added to the miter gauge. Secure the auxiliary fence in position where the hull assembly can be supported by it and be clamped to it. Once again, the procedure will be to sneak up on the intended cut line by making multiple passes. Position the hull assembly to the right of the saw blade. Clamp the hull assembly to the auxiliary fence on the miter gauge. We will be cutting 2L and 1L, or the port side of the hull assembly bow. Make your first cut. For multiple passes, reposition the hull assembly closer to the saw blade and always clamp it into position. Your hands can easily and safely be positioned, allowing you to apply a downward pressure and forward motion into and through the saw blade. This view shows the setup complete with the hull assembly clamped into place and ready to make the first cut. Looking from the rear of the table saw, we can see where the intended cut will be. Don't be concerned about cutting the auxiliary fence attached to the miter gauge. It is replaceable. With the 30-degree angle cut complete on 1L and 2L, or the port side, we can continue to set up the cut for the starboard side. Before we make this cut, you must remove the auxiliary fence attached to the miter gauge. Rotate the miter gauge 45 degrees to the left of the 0-degree position and lock it into place. Reattach the auxiliary fence to the miter gauge, providing support to the rear or stern portion of the hull assembly. Now we're going to cut 1R and 2R to 30 degrees. This is the starboard side of the hull assembly bow. The procedure is the same as before. Sneak up on the intended cut line by making multiple passes. Position the hull assembly to the right of the saw blade. Clamp the hull assembly to the auxiliary fence on the miter gauge and make your first cut. For multiple passes, reposition the hull assembly closer to the saw blade and always clamp it into place. Again, your hands can easily and safely be positioned, allowing you to apply a downward pressure and forward motion into and through the saw blade. This view shows the completed angle cut on 1L and 2L and the preparation to cut 1R and 2R. Notice that the hull assembly is clamped to the auxiliary fence on the miter gauge. Looking from the back of the table saw, we clearly see where the intended cut will be across 1R and 2R. Completed cuts safely and easily. Here we see the 45-degree cuts that have been made to the bow of the hull assembly and also the 30-degree cuts that have been made to the lower hull portion of the bow. Nice and clean, minimum sanding is required. There are no burn marks or scoring because we clamped the hull assembly into place and made the cuts without stopping while entering and exiting the saw blade. Here's the bottom view of the bow portion of the hull assembly. In this close-up view, you will notice that the angle cut made for the entire length of 1R does not match up or align with the angle cut of 2R. Their intersecting points are not the same, and they should be. That was the whole purpose of sneaking up on the cut with multiple passes. So how does this happen? It is most likely a mistake in adjusting the miter gauge. The locked position was not at the intended 45-degree angle. The angle was actually greater than 45 degrees. Because of this error, when the hull assembly was fed into the saw blade, the entrance height was lower than the exit height. The setup was reviewed and the error was found. The miter gauge was readjusted to 45 degrees and locked into position. An attempt was made to salvage the cut. Correcting this problem required moving the assembly closer to the saw blade and straightening the angle cut from entrance to exit. In order to make the assembly symmetrical, the same cut lines were created on the opposite side. With this view, you can see the result more clearly. Does this mean the assembly is unusable? Is it necessary to start all over again? No, only you will know that there was a problem. It does not conflict with any other parts of the assembly. No mating parts need to be modified, and the intended user will never know there was a correction. Rear spacer and stiffener plate. Throughout the entire cutting process, the rear spacer and rear stiffener plate remained attached to the hull assembly. You can see the benefits. First, stability to the hull assembly when feeding it through the table saw blade. An assurance that parts 1L and 1R remain parallel to each other. A guarantee that the angled cut lines on both parts 1L and 1R are equal in height and depth throughout the entire length of the hull. The entrance point and the exit point of the saw blade are the same, providing a means to clamp the assembly to the auxiliary fence of the miter gauge. Safe handling of the assembly during cutting, and at the same time allowing application of downward pressure and sideways pressure to the rip fence. And finally, a backer board, which reduces tear out from the exiting saw blade. Now is the time to remove this plate. Completed hull assembly. Removing the rear spacer and rear stiffener plate make the hull assembly complete. The holes can easily be filled in, sanded flush, and made ready for the finishing colors. But do not throw the spacer away. You may wish to keep it and temporarily clamp it into place for when you're ready to mount the hull assembly to the aircraft carrier's deck. It will again assist you in keeping parts 1L and 1R parallel to each other during the gluing and drying times necessary. And here is the finished hull assembly. Tower modifications on the flight deck. Some small modifications were made to the tower assembly and build-out. Our craftsman Udi made substitutions based on materials that were readily available in his workshop. There's nothing wrong with the original plans, but simply put, why buy something when you already have it? Here is the original tower design in the plans. Each component of the flight deck tower was modified in some way. Let's go through the changes one at a time, working from the bottom, item 7, up to item 8. Item 7, height or thickness was reduced from 1.5 inches to 1.25 inches. Available thickness of stock in the workshop was 5/8 inch, and 5/8 plus 5/8 equals 1.25. Width and length remained the same as in the plans. A one-piece component was made by gluing 2 pieces together. 3 pinstripes were added. Item 4, component dimensions remained the same as in the plans. This component was modified by cutting a 15-degree bevel on all 4 edges, leaving the top 1/8 inch unbeveled. This will give the impression of a beveled window in the final assembly. Item 5, height or thickness was reduced from 3/4 inch to 5/8 inch. Again, that was the available thickness of stock in the workshop. Width and length remained the same as in the plans. Item 4, repeat the previous modification. Item 3, height was increased from 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch. Again, That was the available thickness of stock in the workshop. A 1 1/8 inch shallow hole was drilled in the top to assist in positioning the new item 6. Item 6, original component in the plan, was substituted with a leftover piece of dowel. The dowel is 1 1/8 inch in diameter and 2 inches in length. 2 holes were drilled through the dowel for item 8 using one of Udi's drill press V-block holder setup jigs. A 3/8 inch shallow hole was also drilled in the top of the dowel to accept a wood button plug, also known as a mushroom cap. Item 8. The same dowel diameter was used, but the length defined in the plans was shortened by 1/2 inch for the lower piece. As you can see, the changes made from the plan were not intentional, but driven by available stock, proving that there is no need to buy something if you already have it. The tower dimensions are non-critical since substitutions do not conflict with any other components. Tower components were sealed prior to painting, sanded, and protected with a final coat of varnish. Everything will receive a coat of Cynthia's non-toxic child-safe beeswax. Here is the small parts painting and drying rack showing Udi's hot melt glue and nail support trick. In this view you can see the 1 1/8 inch shallow hole that was drilled into item 3 to assist in positioning the new item 6. Here is Udi's version of the completed tower assembly ready to be attached to the flight deck. Materials used. Let's take a look at the products that were used for sealing the wood prior to painting. Paint used, finish coat, brushes, and accessories. This project required 4 different colors of common craft paints available almost anywhere. There's no particular preference on paint brands, as you can see by the various products shown here. But common sense says, stay with one manufacturer to ensure compatibility between all the products they offer. Here are some of the products that Udi uses regularly on toy making projects. He recommends the Delta Ceramcoat All-Purpose Sealer. Its drying time is quick enough to easily apply the first coat, have dinner, light sand, apply a second coat, and even paint your first coat of color in one evening. You can even skip the second coat and go from first coat to sand and then paint. Most craft paints come in 2 fluid ounce containers. For economy, try to purchase the larger container sizes, such as the 4 and 8 fluid ounce containers of the colors that you know you will use for future projects. Craft paints are almost always on sale since the manufacturers seem to rotate sales between themselves. The brushes that Udi uses are all economically priced. There's no need for high-end artist brushes. A low-cost paint palette is always useful. It allows you to dispense various colors for use at one time. Using multiple brushes at one time and stored in a glass of water when not in use allows you to easily clean the brush off with a paper towel and do that small, quick touch-up. Pen stripes can be made using rolls of 1/8 inch automotive self-adhesive pen stripes. These were used to detail the flight deck and on item 7. The Flecto Varathane Outdoor Gloss is safe to use over craft paints and markers, a protective coating applied to the tower assembly. Test new products in your workshop before you use them on a project. There can be negative reactions between various craft paints, permanent markers, and printed paper labels. Look for bubbling and crackling of the craft paint or a change in color. Check for bleeding on printed labels and loose adhesive on the label backing. Test with permanent color markers too. It always pays to do a series of tests to avoid corrective sanding or a complete rebuild. Red hull bottom plate prep and paint. The hull bottom plate requires an area to be masked prior to painting to ensure better surface-to-surface adhesion where glue will be applied. This bottom plate will be sprayed with a white primer, given time to dry, receive a light sanding, and then the final coat, red, will also be applied by spray painting. This side will be glued to the bottom of the hull assembly. As you can see, the mating part of the hull bottom has been primed, painted, and the tape masking where glue will be applied has been removed. The vision is that this ship will be cruising the high seas of carpeted flooring, area rugs, and so on. Occasionally, it may see rough seas and deep pile carpeting, possibly at Grandma and Grandpa's home. Precautions have been taken in the design process to ensure smooth sailing. The bow is rounded, the square sharp edges are removed after cutting the diagonals, and similarly rounded over the port, starboard, and stern edges. Hopefully, the hull bottom plate will not get snagged on any carpet fibers and prevent scratching if the ship cruises onto a smoother surface. The rounded bow also provides a ramp or skid plate when the ship is pushed against something like a transition strip from hardwood flooring to carpet or even against a tiled floor. Note, if the ship will be primarily used on a hardwood or tile surface, it might be a good idea to modify the hull bottom plate even further by adding a piece of felt to its bottom surface. That would definitely make the Fleet Admiral's mom and dad happy. Here you can see the modification to the hull bottom plate by rounding the sharp edges. Regular painter's masking tape or frog tape can be used. Frog tape should be used when a clean sharp edge is required, as with the flight deck surface. But here, paint bleeding underneath the masking tape was not a concern. All the tape edges will become invisible once the hull bottom plate is attached to the hull assembly. Finally, let's take a look at the painted hull bow rounded edge. This looks very good. The hull bottom plate is ready to be assembled to the hull assembly. This plate was spray painted with a white primer first, allowed to dry, light sanded, and then 2 coats of red spray paint were applied. It will be receiving Cynthia's non-toxic beeswax finish after assembly. Prime coat preparation for MDF hull. Here we'll detail the necessary steps required in preparing the Top Gun aircraft carrier MDF hull for spray painting the primer and the final coat. The MDF hull assembly has been sanded. All the sharp edges have been slightly rounded over for a comfortable feel by future young marine enthusiasts. Because we will be spray painting primer onto the hull, the areas where glue will be applied must be protected from the spray paint for better surface-to-surface adhesion. We need to mask and protect these areas from the primer coat and the final finished coat. Painter's tape was used liberally on the hull bottom. Once again, simple tools were used to trim the tape on the MDF hull bottom side footprint. A straight edge, that's plastic, wood, or metal, a sharp blade knife like an X-Acto or utility knife. Make multiple light strokes with the knife blade until you cut through the tape. A heavy hand is not required here, but if you did leave a score mark in the wood, it's no big deal. Glue will be applied to this surface and a bottom plate will be attached to the hull bottom, making any marks invisible. The top surface or footprint of the MDF hull must also be masked off, protecting the areas where glue will be applied. As done previously, painter's tape was used liberally on the footprint where glue will be applied. This concludes this section on protecting all the glue areas. There will be better surface-to-surface adhesion for these parts during assembly. You will notice that the temporary spacer block and the rear stiffener plate have been removed, and the screw holes to secure the rear stiffener plate have been filled in and sanded smooth. One more application of filler to the dimples, a quick sanding, and the MDF hull is ready for spray painting with primer. Spray painting final coat on the hull. Notice that the center sharpened standoff pegs have been removed and a couple of the outside ring standoff pegs have been repositioned in some of the center ring positions. The inside of the hull front or bow was spray painted first by holding the hull by hand and spraying inside the hull. By doing it this way, you can get the spray paint can closer to the inside surface for better coverage. After allowing the top surface coat to dry, continue with painting the bottom of the hull. This looks good with even paint coverage, so let's look at some of the other edges. Again, this looks good with even coverage. Perfect! Good and even paint coverage. This looks good too, except for that little speck of something on the left side. Sometimes small specks fly in when spray painting outside, but that's no big deal. Let it dry, pick it off, and reapply the spray paint. It will be as good as new. you can see both the hull and flight deck are being sun-dried. The painter's tape used to mask the areas where glue will be applied has been removed. Here you can see the bottom of the hull assembly where the hull bottom plate will be attached and the top of the hull where the flight deck will be attached. The hull assembly is dried and complete, ready for final assembly. Tips on flight deck detailing. Let's reflect on previous steps. We discussed how to prepare the flight deck and hull assembly with white primer. The entire flight deck surface was painted a light gray and the hull assembly painted a dark gray. All of these paints should be available locally. Prior to spray painting, it was necessary to mask certain areas from spray paint. The purpose of the masking was to protect certain areas where glue will be applied in order to achieve a better surface-to-surface adhesion. Here are some of the tools and the tapes used. The frog tape was used when spray painting the red landing strip. The purpose of using frog tape was to eliminate the possibility of paint bleed underneath the tape, resulting in a poor quality edge. Using the frog tape was an experiment and proved to be quite successful. The common painter's tapes were used where bleeding was not a concern, protecting areas where glue will be applied. An X-Acto knife and a metal straight edge were also used. Now let's look at the flight deck details. This is the finished flight deck. A few additions were made to the plan set purchased from ToyMakingPlans.com. Prior to deciding the details to add to this flight deck, Udi searched the internet for aircraft carrier flight deck photos, models, and etc. From there, he got the idea of adding additional details to the landing strip, such as the white banding on each edge of the landing strip to make it stand out and the dotted white line down the center. These strips were added using automotive self-adhesive accent stripes, also known as pinstripes. A piece of metal found in the workshop was put to good use as a straight edge when applying the two outside white stripes. No measuring, just good old-fashioned eyeballing. The helicopter pad was kept very simple. And again, the location was eyeballed. Some tape was applied with white and red pinstripes, and the edges were trimmed. From the internet search, Udi noticed that every model had accentuated elevator platforms. So he added 2 elevator platforms to his flight deck. The sizes were not pre-calculated. The first piece of red tape was laid down, and then the second piece was laid down. Then the 2 pieces were tied together with a top strip joining both ends. The spacing was defined by a random item found in the workshop and used as a spacer. The strips were made equal in length in the corners using a second spacer and then worked around to the middle of the line. That's the reason the strip in the middle is wider than the rest. It's a great look. Most of the photos and models that were reviewed had flight deck steam-driven plane launchers, so Udi added 3. Again, by eyeballing, the lines were kept parallel to the edge of the flight deck outline it was closest to. Finally, the ship number was added. These numbers are 3 inches in height. They were purchased at a big box store as common house numbers or mailbox numbers. There was some trouble adhering those to the flight deck because the adhesive used on these labels are not easy to reposition. If you accidentally do a fold-over, that's when the adhesive sticks to itself, it's almost impossible to get it unstuck. Udi would not recommend using these stickers. The next time he does this, he will paint the numbers on or print them on a shipping label, cut them out, and then adhere them to the flight deck. Apply a coat of Delta Craft paint varnish to protect them, and that's it. How did he decide what his ship number would be? Well, that's easy. It was his birthday. Notice the small square area where bare MDF is exposed. This area was masked with tape prior to spray painting. This is where the ship's tower will be glued after it is assembled and painted. It's a lot easier working without the tower compared to having to work around it. And there you have it. The finished flight deck is detailed. Everything will be coated using Cynthia's non-toxic beeswax. So what automotive pinstripes were used? These pinstripes are 1/8 inch wide. The same colors were purchased in 1/4 inch widths for future projects. Each color cost around $5.99 in Canadian. Some items were not available locally, so Udi looked online for yellow pinstripes, numbers, and model decals. Remember using model decals as a child? They're so easy to apply by dipping them in water and sticking them to your model. Prime coat preparation for the flight deck. Here we'll detail the necessary steps required in preparing the Top Gun aircraft carrier flight deck. for spray painting with primer and the final coat. Both the MDF hull assembly and the MDF flight deck have been sanded and are ready for the primer to be applied. Position the hull assembly on the underside of the flight deck. Trace its outline onto the MDF. Mask the footprint of the hull in the places where glue will be applied when attaching the hull to the flight deck. Here you can clearly see the trace lines after the hull footprint was traced. Green painter's tape was applied to mask the areas from spray paint. Put the green tape over the trace lines. The original trace lines will be visible through the tape. Trim the tape on the inside of the trace lines or inside the footprint by about 1/8 inch or more. No accuracy is needed here. The purpose of this is to cover a visible gap between the hull and the flight deck after assembly. You won't see any bare wood, which gives you a professional finish. Tools used to trim the tape. Simple tools were used to trim the tape inside the hull footprint trace areas. Green painter's tape, a straight edge that's plastic, wood, or metal, a sharp blade knife like an X-Acto or a utility knife. Again, make multiple light strokes with the knife blade until you cut through the tape. A heavy hand is not required here. Final step. Don't forget to flip the flight deck over, exposing the flight deck surface. This area needs to be masked off for the control tower location. Spray painting the final coat on the flight deck. Here you can see a 5-gallon pail with the newly built rotating table on top of the pail. Notice that all the pegs are in their original position. Now the flight deck is placed bottom side up on the rotating table standoff pegs. Note, after lightly sanding the primer coat and before the spray painting process begins, wipe the entire top, bottom, and edges with a tack cloth to remove any particles that may be left behind. Here you can see the spray painting demonstrated. All the edges are painted first, then the entire bottom surface is painted. Whenever possible, try to start the spray away from the surface and then move the spray over to the surface. This eliminates pooling of the spray paint. Notice that the new rotating table has seen some action. That's what it's for. Continue by moving the flight deck into place so the top surface is exposed for spray painting. The setup for the painting process is fairly simple. Take a 5-gallon pail, tip it upside down, and place the rotating table on top. Notice that all the pegs are in their original position. The deck has been positioned on the rotating table, bottom surface facing up. Again, this was done to get a feel for the new can of spray paint, how it will spray, cover, and adhere. So go through the same steps when you spray paint the primer coat. Any problems can be easily fixed after drying. Simply resand if required and repaint the final coat again. This is an invisible surface to the final user and a great place to do a test spray. After spray painting the bottom surface, it was positioned on some spacer blocks to be sun-dried. Here the deck top surface has been sprayed. It looks nice and clean with even coverage. Now let's take a closer look at the finish on the edges. This looks nice and clean with good coverage too. The MDF could have used some additional preparation and sanding, but it's quite acceptable as it is. If this is an issue, apply a coating of gesso to fill in some of the dimples and then sand. Again, this looks nice and clean with good coverage. All the edges are perfect and we're ready for assembly. Final assembly. At last, the moment we have all been waiting for, the final assembly of the Top Gun aircraft carrier. All key components have been gathered together. The flight deck, tower assembly, hull assembly, and the hull bottom plate. Step 1. First, attach the hull bottom plate to the hull. Start with the hull assembly. Apply a very thin coat of glue to the exposed area of MDF, which was protected from spray painting with the masking tape. Good old carpenter's glue was used. Next, apply a very thin coat of glue to the mating hull bottom plate. Use a damp cloth to wipe off excess glue at the edges. Let this sit for a short time, allowing the glue to be absorbed by the MDF. Just a couple of minutes is all that is necessary. Now position the parts, add pressure with weights, wipe off any glue that squeezes out, and let it sit for 20 minutes. Step 2. Now to attach the hull assembly to the bottom of the flight deck. Before applying the glue, position the hull assembly onto the flight deck and mark its location with a pencil on the flight deck bottom surface. These registration marks ensure proper positioning when glue is applied. No need to worry if the pencil marks are visible. It's on the underside of the flight deck, an area that will rarely be viewed. Apply glue as before. Mount the hull assembly to the flight deck, apply weights, and let it sit for 1 hour. Let's take a look at what our craftsman Udi did. There's no need for clamps. It would be very difficult to properly clamp this assembly. Only weights are needed. Udi used landscape bricks. It's always a good thing to have a few around the workshop. Sandwich a piece of wax paper between the weights and this part to keep glue from squeezing out everywhere. No wax papers handy? Well, here's a quick solution. Use a dish towel instead. Udi uses another one of his standard workshop weight tools for additional weight. A couple of paint cans. This is all you need for clamping pressure. Now let's take a look at the completed assembly. Notice the F-14 is just flying off the flight deck. And here's another angle of that F-14.
Thanks for watching. We're ToyMakingPlans.com. We serve a worldwide community of toy makers who make toys for fun, for profit, and for charity. Visit our website often for special promotions, weekly new toy plan releases, and subscribe to our free Wood Toy News e-zine. I'm Connie Christians, ToyMakingPlans.com videographer and video editor. Thanks for watching and happy toy making!